We are told that 10,000 years ago humans were mere hunter-gatherers, yet buried under the hills of Turkey and the jungles of Java are megalithic blueprints that defy the laws of primitive logic. We find stones fused together by heat that mimics a nuclear blast, and granite sarcophagi cut with a precision that requires diamond-tipped saws, thousands of years before the invention of steel. Is it possible that humanity has restarted more than once? Are we a species with amnesia, walking over the graves of gods we've forgotten were actually our ancestors? Tonight, we go beyond the museum glass. But ask yourself, if our ancestors were as primitive as they say, why did they leave behind a blueprint of the stars? Are we exploring the ruins of a lost world, or are we looking into a mirror of our own future? Could the out-of-place artifacts be the final warnings of a civilization that collapsed before we even began? Before we dive into the abyss of the past, I want to know who is joining this journey. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it at your place right now? Let me know in the comments below. There is a fundamental assumption in archaeology that almost never gets questioned. Civilizations evolve in visible steps. Tools improve gradually, art becomes more refined over time, and large-scale monumental works only emerge after long periods of experimentation. But at a remote site known as Giants of Monte Prama, that logic collapses entirely. Because here, without warning, without clear predecessors, and without any written record to explain it, a civilization suddenly produced dozens of monumental stone statues over 2 meters tall, carved with precision, symmetry, and a visual language that does not belong to any known tradition of the ancient world. And then, just as suddenly, they were all violently destroyed, shattered into thousands of fragments, and buried as if someone had deliberately erased them from history. This site lies on the western side of Sardinia, near the small town of Cabras, overlooking a coastal plain that once formed part of a much larger cultural landscape. This region was dominated by the Nuragic civilization, a society that flourished from the 2nd millennium before Christ, and is best known for constructing thousands of massive stone towers called nuraghi. These structures suggest a high degree of engineering skill and social organisation, yet the Nuragic people left behind almost no written language, no detailed inscriptions, and no historical records that could explain their capabilities. Monte Prama itself appears to have been a burial complex rather than a major settlement, which makes the presence of large-scale monumental sculpture here even more perplexing. It is not positioned in a capital, yet not aligned with a known temple complex, and not integrated into a clearly defined urban centre. It exists in isolation, both geographically and historically. The discovery of the site was not the result of a planned excavation, but an accident that would eventually redefine the understanding of early Mediterranean art. In 1974, local farmers working the land began uncovering unusual stone fragments while ploughing their fields. At first, these pieces seemed insignificant, but as more fragments emerged, curved shapes, carved surfaces, and eventually recognizable anatomical forms, it became clear that they belonged to something far more complex. Archaeologists were called in, and systematic excavations began. What they uncovered was astonishing. Thousands of broken stone pieces scattered across the site, representing the remains of at least 30 to 40 large statues. These were not naturally collapsed structures. The fragments showed clear signs of deliberate breakage, with impact patterns and dispersal suggesting that the statues had been intentionally smashed and buried. The most unsettling aspect of Monte Prama is not simply the existence of the statues, but the time in which they were created. Radiocarbon dating and associated artifacts place them roughly between the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ. This is a critical detail because it places them at a moment when large-scale stone sculpture was still in its early stages across much of Europe. Even in Greece, the famous Kouros statues, often considered the beginning of monumental human sculpture in the Western tradition, appear slightly later and follow a completely different aesthetic logic. The Monte Prama figures, by contrast, are rigid, yet stylized, geometric yet expressive, with exaggerated circular eyes composed of concentric rings that seem almost abstract in design. Their bodies are structured with clear proportional systems, their armour and weapons rendered with consistency, and their forms repeated across multiple figures with a level of standardization that implies an organised production process rather than isolated artistic attempts. Archaeological campaigns throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries have gradually reconstructed parts of this puzzle. Thousands of fragments have been catalogued, cleaned, and reassembled in laboratories, leading to the partial restoration of several statues now displayed in museums. These figures fall into distinct categories: boxers with raised shields, archers equipped with detailed quivers and bows, and warriors bearing helmets and protective gear. Alongside them, smaller stone models of Nurag towers were also discovered, suggesting a symbolic link between the architecture of the civilization and the figures themselves. Material analysis confirms that the statues were carved from local sandstone, yet the precision of the cuts and the consistency of the shapes indicate controlled techniques that are difficult to reconcile with the limited toolkits typically attributed to the region during this period. Traces on the stone surfaces suggest the use of metal tools, likely bronze, but the level of refinement raises questions about the exact methods employed and the degree of skill required to maintain such uniformity across multiple large-scale works. Equally puzzling is the context in which these statues were placed. They were positioned above relatively simple burial structures, small cist graves, that do not reflect the monumental scale of the sculptures above them. This imbalance suggests that the statues may not have been intended merely as grave markers. Instead, they may have served a broader symbolic or political function, projecting power, identity, or ancestral authority across the landscape. Yet without written records, the meaning of these figures remains entirely speculative, forcing researchers to rely on comparison and inference rather than direct evidence. Several competing hypotheses attempt to explain Monte Prama, but none provide a complete answer. One interpretation suggests that the Nuragic civilization developed this sculptural tradition independently, reaching a level of artistic and technical sophistication that has been underestimated by modern scholarship. While this would explain the uniqueness of the statues, it does not account for the absence of earlier developmental stages or intermediate forms. Another theory proposes external influence, particularly from Eastern Mediterranean cultures such as the Phoenicians. However, the stylistic elements of Monte Prama do not closely match any known artistic tradition from those regions, making direct influence difficult to prove. A more symbolic interpretation views the statues as representations of legendary warriors or ancestral figures, constructed to reinforce social cohesion or elite status. This aligns with their placement in a funerary context, yet it still fails to explain the scale, uniformity, and sudden emergence of the phenomenon. Perhaps the most controversial hypothesis is that Monte Prama represents the remnants of a cultural phase that was abruptly disrupted or intentionally erased. The systematic destruction of the statues supports the idea of a deliberate act, possibly linked to invasion, ideological change, or internal conflict, but the identity of those responsible and their motives remain unknown. Monte Prama ultimately stands as a contradiction embedded in stone. It presents clear evidence of advanced artistic planning, technical execution, and social organisation, yet it exists without the supporting framework that typically accompanies such achievements. There is no written explanation, no gradual evolution, and no direct continuation. It appears fully formed and then disappears, leaving behind only fragments and questions. If history is understood as a continuous narrative, then this site represents a rupture in that narrative, a moment where the expected sequence of development breaks down. And perhaps the most unsettling implication is not what Monte Prama reveals, but what it suggests we're missing. Because if a civilization capable of producing such works can vanish so completely that it leaves behind only broken stone, then the history we believe we understand may be far less complete than we are willing to admit. There are ruins that crumble, and there are ruins that refuse to make sense. Ahlat does not confront you with towering temples or impossible monoliths. Instead, it presents something far more unsettling. A landscape of stone that looks consistent, too consistent. Thousands of basalt tombstones rising from the earth, each one carved with a level of precision that should fluctuate, degrade, or evolve over time, but doesn't. In a world where ancient craftsmanship is expected to vary from one artisan to another, Ahlat appears almost standardized, as if governed by a system we no longer understand. It is not the presence of advanced detail that breaks logic here, but the repetition of it across centuries, as if error itself had been removed from the process. Positioned along the northwestern shores of Lake Van, Nur Ahlat once stood as a critical node in medieval Anatolia, particularly under the Seljuk Empire, where trade, military strategy and cultural exchange converged along the lake's vast inland expanse. The geography alone explains its importance, but it does not explain what survived. The city itself has been destroyed, rebuilt, and erased multiple times through Mongol invasions, regional conflicts and shifting empires. What remains most intact today is not its architecture of power, but its architecture of memory, a cemetery so vast it has become one of the largest medieval Islamic burial grounds ever documented. Spread across the landscape are more than 8,000 standing tombstones, many reaching heights of 3 to 4 meters, carved from dense volcanic basalt, a material notoriously resistant to shaping and detail work. Unlike buried cities such as Troy, Ahlat was never entirely lost to time. Local populations were always aware of the cemetery, but its deeper significance only began to attract attention in the late 19th century, when European travellers and Ottoman scholars started documenting its scale. By the early 20th century, historians had identified it as a major Seljuk necropolis, and systematic studies began to map and catalogue the stones. Yet even after more than a century of observation, Ahlat remains only partially understood. Many inscriptions have yet to be fully translated, and large portions of the site have never undergone comprehensive archaeological excavation. What researchers found was not just a cemetery, but something closer to a structured, encoded archive embedded in stone. The most striking anomaly lies not in a single artifact, but in the collective uniformity of thousands. Each tombstone exhibits sharply carved Arabic inscriptions, intricate geometric patterns, and symbolic motifs arranged with remarkable consistency. The surfaces are often flattened to an almost polished finish, the engravings cut with controlled depth and clean edges, suggesting a level of technical discipline that should be difficult to maintain manually across generations. Basalt, unlike softer limestone, resists fine carving and fractures unpredictably under uneven pressure. Yet in Ahlat, the carvings show minimal deviation, as though the artisans operated under a standardized method or toolset capable of controlling these variables with precision. This is where the comparison becomes unavoidable. At Machu Picchu, the Incas achieved extraordinary stone-fitting accuracy, but their work emphasizes macro-scale engineering rather than micro-level inscription density. In contrast, artifacts like the Pylos combat agate demonstrate microscopic carving precision, but only on a single object. Ahlat combines both extremes. It delivers repeated high-detail carving across thousands of large, heavy and difficult materials, sustained over centuries without a visible drop in quality. This is not an isolated achievement. It is a system. Modern analysis has attempted to break down how such a system could exist. Geological studies confirm the hardness and density of the basalt used, reinforcing the difficulty of achieving such smooth surfaces and fine engravings. Toolmark analysis suggests metal instruments were used, but no definitive evidence identifies the exact alloys or methods capable of producing such uniform results. The inscriptions themselves vary in content, recording names, titles, genealogies, and sometimes poetic texts, yet their stylistic execution remains tightly controlled. Even more intriguing are the recurring geometric patterns, complex, repeating structures that resemble advanced tessellations, hinting at mathematical knowledge or symbolic frameworks beyond simple decoration. Some researchers have proposed that these patterns may encode information, functioning as a secondary layer of meaning embedded alongside the text. While Islamic art is known for its geometric sophistication, certain motifs in Ahlat do not fully align with known stylistic traditions, raising the possibility that they served a purpose we have not yet deciphered. In this interpretation, the cemetery transforms from a burial site into a structured information system where identity, status, belief, and possibly cosmological concepts are recorded in a hybrid language of script and geometry. Archaeological campaigns throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries have continued to document, preserve, and analyse the site, but they have also revealed how incomplete our understanding remains. Many stones are eroded or damaged, others still partially buried, and surrounding areas hint at additional layers of settlement beneath the visible surface. Given Ahlat's history of destruction and reconstruction, it is plausible that earlier phases of the city lie hidden below, as much like the stratified layers observed in sites such as Derinkuyu or even the multi-layered ruins of Troy itself. If so, the current cemetery may represent only one phase of a much longer and more complex occupation sequence. The debate surrounding Ahlat continues to evolve. The dominant explanation attributes its precision to a highly organised tradition of master craftsmen, trained through generations in a controlled system of production. This would imply the existence of a guild-like structure capable of maintaining strict standards over long periods. However, no surviving documentation describes such a system in sufficient detail. Another theory suggests that the Seljuks possessed more advanced tools or metallurgical techniques than currently recognised, though again, physical evidence remains limited. A more speculative perspective views the site as a form of encoded archive, where geometry and inscription combine to store layered meanings, a concept that challenges conventional interpretations of funerary art. What makes Ahlat unsettling is not that it defies explanation entirely, but that it exists within reach of explanation without ever fully yielding to it. It sits in a space between known history and missing methodology, where the outputs are visible, measurable, and undeniable, yet the processes behind them remain fragmented. The stones stand in silence, not because they lack information, but because they may contain too much of it, organised in ways we have not yet learned to read. In the end, Ahlat forces a different kind of question. Not whether ancient people were capable of advanced techniques, but how many such systems have existed, functioned with precision, and then disappeared without leaving behind the instructions that made them possible. It is not a mystery of absence, but of disconnection. Ahlat is a complete record without a complete key. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the knowledge was never lost in the sense of being destroyed. It was lost in the sense that we no longer recognize it when we see it. Across ancient history, civilizations followed a pattern so consistent it feels almost instinctive. They worshipped the sun. From Egypt to the Maya, from Mesopotamia to Rome, the sun symbolized life, power, and divine authority. It dictated calendars, agriculture, and kingship itself. But there was one city that rejected this universal logic, a city that turned away from the sun, and instead aligned its identity, its rituals, and possibly even its architecture with the moon, a celestial body associated not with dominance, but with cycles, shadows, and subtlety. Even more unsettling, this was not a fringe belief. It endured for thousands of years, surviving empires, religions, and intellectual revolutions. The city did not collapse under its contradiction. It thrived within it. And that city was Harran, and its existence forces a question that challenges everything we assume about ancient knowledge. What if some civilizations were not primitive at all, but simply operating on a different system of understanding? Harran is located in what is now southeastern Turkey, near the border with Syria, within the historical region of Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Its position placed it at a strategic intersection between Anatolia and the Levant, making it a vital node in ancient trade networks. References to Harran appear in texts dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE, including Assyrian records and later classical sources. Unlike dominant imperial capitals such as Babylon, Harran was never the centre of a vast empire, and yet it persisted, continuously inhabited, continuously relevant, for millennia. This alone is unusual. Many great cities rose and fell with their empires. Harran did neither. It remained, adapting, absorbing, but never fully losing its identity. In a region defined by conquest and transformation, Harran's continuity is itself an anomaly. Unlike many ancient sites that were buried and rediscovered, Harran was never truly lost. Its structures, particularly the iconic beehive houses, continued to be inhabited into modern times. However, systematic study began in the 19th century, when European explorers entered the region. In 1850, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, known for his excavations at Nineveh, documented Harran as a site of significant historical importance. Later, throughout the 20th century, Turkish and international archaeological teams conducted surveys and excavations, gradually revealing layers of occupation spanning from the Bronze Age through the Islamic period. One of the challenges in studying Harran is precisely its continuity. Because the site was never fully abandoned, archaeological layers are intertwined with the later habitation. This makes clean excavation difficult, but also provides a rare opportunity. Harran is not just a ruin, it is a living timeline. The most profound mystery of Harran lies in the convergence of three elements that, on their own, are impressive, but together become almost impossible to explain. Its lunar-centered religion, its climate-optimized architecture, and its potential astronomical alignment. Harran was one of the last strongholds of the cult of Sin, the Mesopotamian moon god. While other civilizations emphasize solar deities, Rhea in Egypt, Helios in Greece, Harran elevated the moon to primary status. This was not symbolic preference. It shaped the city's identity over thousands of years, persisting even as surrounding cultures shifted. At the same time, Harran's architecture reveals an unexpected level of environmental adaptation. The beehive houses, constructed entirely from mud brick without wood or metal supports, maintain stable interior temperatures despite extreme desert heat. Their makhrut-shaped geometry reduces heat absorption and enhances air circulation. Compared to Roman engineering, which relied on concrete and complex vaulting, Harran's solution appears deceptively simple, yet equally effective. Some researchers suggest that the city's layout and religious structures may also reflect lunar cycles. While definitive proof remains elusive, the consistency of the moon's presence in both symbolic and spatial contexts raises the possibility that Harran's builders were working with a structured understanding of celestial patterns. Individually, each of these elements could be explained. Together they suggest something more, a system of knowledge that was integrated, intentional, and far more sophisticated than traditionally assumed. Archaeological work in Harran has uncovered multiple phases of construction, particularly at the site of the Moon Temple dedicated to Sin. Evidence shows that the temple was rebuilt and maintained across successive empires, including the Assyria and later Islamic rulers, indicating the enduring importance of the cult. Inscriptions and historical accounts confirm Harran's role as a centre of learning, especially during late antiquity. Following the closure of the Platonic Academy, scholars fleeing Byzantine territories are believed to have migrated eastward, bringing with them Greek philosophical and scientific texts. Harran became one of the locations where this knowledge was preserved and translated into Arabic, contributing to the intellectual foundation of the Islamic Golden Age. Material analysis of the beehive houses has demonstrated their remarkable thermal efficiency. Modern studies comparing these structures to conventional rectangular buildings in similar climates show significantly lower internal temperature fluctuations. This suggests not just empirical trial and error, but a refined architectural tradition optimized over generations. Compared to sites like Rome, where engineering complexity is evident in scale and material, Harran represents a different paradigm, efficiency through form rather than force. It is a quieter kind of sophistication, one that leaves fewer obvious traces but maybe no less advanced. Scholars remain divided on how to interpret Harran's anomalies. One school of thought argues that everything observed can be explained through gradual cultural evolution. In this view, the city's architecture, religion and intellectual role are the result of accumulated experience over centuries, without requiring any lost or advanced knowledge. Another perspective suggests that Harran may have functioned as a localized center of specialized knowledge, particularly in astronomy and environmental adaptation. Its long-term focus on the moon, combined with its role in preserving Greek science, raises the possibility that it possessed a deeper intellectual tradition than currently documented. More speculative theories propose that Harran's alignment with lunar cycles reflects a formal system of astronomical measurement, perhaps comparable in intent, if not in scale, to sites like Stonehenge. While evidence for precise alignments remains inconclusive, the idea continues to attract attention due to the city's unique religious focus. What complicates all interpretations is the lack of definitive records. Harran leaves behind patterns, structures and hints, but not clear explanations. It is a puzzle with most of its pieces missing, yet enough remaining to suggest a picture far more complex than expected. Harran does not overwhelm with size or spectacle. It does something more unsettling. It quietly contradicts the assumptions we rely on to understand ancient history. It suggests that progress is not always linear, that knowledge can be preserved in unexpected places, and that entire systems of understanding can exist outside the dominant narrative. City that chose the moon over the sun, a society that built near-perfect climate systems without modern science, a cultural node that helped carry ancient knowledge across civilizations without ever becoming an empire itself. Harran should not make sense, and yet it does, just not within the framework we're used to. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is this: how many other Harrans have we already overlooked, simply because they did not fit the story we expected to find? There are places on Earth that force us to question what ancient civilizations were capable of building, and then there are places that do something far more unsettling, places that look like they were built, even when no one ever touched them. High on a granite cliff in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a human face once stared out across a valley for thousands of years. It had a forehead, a nose, lips, and a chin aligned with a precision that would not look out of place in a sculpted monument. But no tools carved it. No civilization claimed it. The deeper you examine it, the more it breaks a simple assumption we rely on to understand the past, that complex forms imply deliberate design, because this one did not. The formation known as Old Man of the Mountain once projected from the face of Cannon Mountain, overlooking Franconia Notch, a glacial valley carved at the end of the last ice age. From a very specific viewing angle along the valley floor, 5 separate granite ledges aligned into a near-perfect human profile. Each segment formed a distinct anatomical feature, yet none of them were physically connected in the way a sculptor would construct a statue. They were independent blocks, resting at slightly different depths and angles, held in place only by gravity, friction, and geological chance. Move a few meters to either side and the face dissolved instantly into meaningless rock. Stay in the precise viewing corridor, and the illusion reassembled with startling clarity, as if it had been deliberately designed to exist only for those who stood in exactly the right place. The formation entered recorded history in 1805, when surveyors Francis Whitcomb and Luke Brooks first documented it while mapping the region. What is striking is not just the discovery itself, but the implication behind it. For thousands of years before that moment, the structure may have existed in plain sight, yet only revealed its full form under a specific alignment of observer and landscape. There is no clear evidence that indigenous populations treated it as a central monument or engineered landmark, suggesting that even if it was seen, its full geometric coherence might not always have been recognized. In other words, the face was not simply there. It was conditional, dependent on perception, angle, and distance. That alone introduces a concept far closer to intentional design than random formation. What makes Old Man of the Mountain uniquely unsettling is not just that it resembled a human face, but how precisely it did so under the right conditions. The proportions between the forehead, nasal bridge, lips, and chin were not abstract or vague, as is common in natural pareidolia. They were proportionally coherent. In classical sculpture, achieving a convincing human profile requires careful attention to ratios and spatial alignment. Here, those relationships emerge from 5 fractured granite masses shaped by freeze-thaw cycles over millennia. The underlying rock, Conway granite, had been weakened by natural fissures, which gradually widened as water seeped in, froze, expanded, and repeated the process over thousands of seasonal cycles. The result was a series of protruding ledges, but the alignment of those ledges into a recognizable human profile remained statistically extraordinary. Geological processes explain the mechanism, but they do not fully resolve the improbability of the final form. Equally puzzling is the structure's long-term stability. By conventional geological models, formations composed of separated, unsupported blocks are inherently temporary. They should degrade, shift, or collapse under repeated stress from thermal expansion, ice wedging, and gravitational creep. Yet Old Man of the Mountain endured for at least 10,000 years, likely forming as glaciers retreated and exposed the cliff face. During that entire span, it maintained not just its existence, but its specific alignment. That persistence begins to resemble the paradox seen in certain ancient megalithic structures, where enormous stones remain balanced in configurations that appear precarious, yet survive across vast stretches of time. The difference here is that no human engineering was involved, and yet the outcome mirrored the visual precision of one. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the formation became the subject of increasing scientific and cultural attention. Engineers and geologists studied its fractures, measured its angles, and attempted to predict its longevity. By the early 20th century, concerns about its stability led to direct intervention. Steel rods were drilled into the rock to anchor key sections. Turnbuckles were installed to counteract shifting forces, and epoxy was applied to reinforce cracks. These monitoring devices tracked micro-movements in the structure. These efforts were not attempts to create the formation, but to preserve it. An ironic reversal in which modern technology struggled to maintain something that natural processes had already sustained for millennia. The need for such intervention underscores a central contradiction. If the structure was so fragile that it required engineering to survive in modern times, how did it persist unaided through thousands of years of harsher climatic cycles? That contradiction reached its breaking point on May 3, 2003. Sometime during the night, without any major earthquake or catastrophic weather event, the formation collapsed. By morning, the iconic profile was gone, reduced to scattered debris at the base of the cliff. Just subsequent analysis pointed to the gradual accumulation of stress fractures, exacerbated by water infiltration and freeze-thaw expansion. At a technical level, the explanation is sound, but it does not fully address the deeper question that had always surrounded the formation. Why did a structure so delicately balanced endure for millennia, only to fail within the narrow window of modern observation? The timing feels less like a simple endpoint and more like a threshold, as if the system had been approaching instability for centuries and finally crossed it at the moment when it was being most closely studied and documented. The primary scientific explanation for the formation's appearance is pareidolia, the cognitive tendency of the human brain to recognize familiar patterns, especially faces in random stimuli. This phenomenon is well documented and explains why we see shapes in clouds or figures in rock formations. However, pareidolia typically produces vague or suggestive forms, not sharply defined, proportionally accurate profiles. Old Man of the Mountain exceeded that threshold. Its features were not merely implied, they were structured. The alignment required to produce the face was narrow and precise, and the resulting image was immediately recognizable even to first-time observers. This pushes the explanation into a more uncomfortable territory, where coincidence must account not just for resemblance, but for structured resemblance. Alternative theories, while lacking evidence, have occasionally surfaced at the fringes of interpretation. Some have speculated that ancient peoples may have subtly modified the formation. enhancing natural features in ways that left no obvious traces. Others have suggested that the alignment itself could have held symbolic or observational significance, perhaps linked to sightlines within the landscape. None of these ideas are supported by archaeological findings. No tool marks, no associated structures, and no cultural artifacts have been found that connect human activity to the shaping of the formation. As a result, these hypotheses remain speculative, yet their persistence reflects a broader discomfort with attributing such a precise outcome entirely to chance. When compared to explicitly human-made monuments such as Mount Rushmore, the contrast becomes even more striking. Mount Rushmore required decades of planning, drilling, blasting, and sculpting to achieve 4 recognizable human faces. Old Man of the Mountain required none of that, yet from the correct vantage point, it achieved a comparable level of visual recognition using nothing but natural processes. The implication is not that nature is imitating human design, but that the boundary between designed and undesigned forms may be less clear than we assume. If a random geological process can produce something that looks intentional, then our criteria for identifying intentionality become less reliable. In the end, Old Man of the Mountain does not leave behind a mystery in the traditional archaeological sense. There are no lost technologies to rediscover, no inscriptions to decode, no civilization to reconstruct. Instead, it leaves behind a more subtle and unsettling problem. It challenges the instinct to see purpose where there may be none, while simultaneously presenting a form that seems too precise to be purposeless. Its collapse did not resolve that tension. It only removed the physical object and left the question behind. And perhaps that is its lasting impact. Not as a relic of an ancient culture, but as a reminder that the human mind is constantly negotiating the line between randomness and design, often without realizing how thin that line truly is. There is a rule that ancient Egypt never broke. Death was not an end, but a carefully engineered transition, perfected over thousands of years through ritual, architecture, and belief. Every pharaoh followed the same logic: build in sacred ground, align with divine order, surround the body with gods who would guide the soul beyond. And yet, one ruler rejected every part of that system. Akhenaten did not just alter religion, he dismantled the entire framework that defined eternity itself. He abandoned the sacred valleys, erased the old gods, and constructed a tomb in a place that, by all known standards of Egyptian theology, should never have been chosen. Then, after his death, his name was erased, his monuments defaced, and his body possibly removed. A king who attempted to control the afterlife, but could not control what came after him. The tomb of Akhenaten lies within the barren cliffs of Amarna, a city that did not exist before his reign and did not survive long after it. This was not simply a capital, it was a controlled experiment, built from nothing to serve a single purpose: the worship of the sun disk, Aten. Unlike Thebes, where temples accumulated over centuries and religious authority was deeply rooted, Amarna was intentionally isolated, positioned in open desert where the horizon was unobstructed, allowing sunlight to dominate both the physical and symbolic landscape. In contrast, nearly every pharaoh before and after chose the Valley of the Kings, a location embedded with cosmological meaning, surrounded by tombs designed to replicate the journey of the sun through the underworld. By rejecting that valley, Akhenaten did more than change location. Nami severed himself from the entire theological map of death. The site itself was first systematically documented during the late 19th century as European expeditions turned their attention to Amarna. Among the most significant figures was Flinders Petrie, whose work in the 1890s helped establish the archaeological framework of the city and its royal tomb. What they found was not a preserved monument, but a disrupted one. Walls had been deliberately hacked apart, reliefs mutilated, inscriptions erased with precision rather than decay. This was not the damage of time, but the signature of intent. The tomb had not simply been abandoned, It had been targeted, as though someone had returned with the specific purpose of undoing what had been created there. The most striking and unsettling feature of the tomb is not its damage, but what it lacks. In every other royal burial site across Egypt, the walls are filled with a complex pantheon guiding the deceased through the afterlife. Osiris presiding over judgment, Anubis overseeing embalming, Re travelling through the night sky. In Akhenaten's tomb, none of them appear. They are not replaced, but erased. In their place, there is only Aten, represented as a radiant disk whose rays extend downward, each ending in a small hand offering the Ankh, the symbol of life. There is no underworld, no weighing of the heart, no narrative of passage. The afterlife is no longer a journey, but a direct connection to light. This is not a variation of Egyptian belief, it is a complete redefinition, and yet it raises a problem that remains unresolved. And so, if the traditional mechanisms of the afterlife were removed, then what replaced them? What did Akhenaten believe would happen to the soul when all known systems were stripped away? Excavations throughout the 20th century added fragments to this puzzle. Portions of a red granite sarcophagus, believed to belong to Akhenaten, were recovered in pieces, decorated not with protective deities, but with figures of Nefertiti in roles traditionally occupied by gods. This substitution was not symbolic decoration. It was structural, indicating that the royal family itself had become central to the new religious system. Wall reliefs depict intimate scenes rarely seen in earlier royal tombs. The king and queen beneath the Aten, interacting with their children, receiving life directly from its rays. The artistic style is equally anomalous. It is with elongated skulls, narrow limbs, and exaggerated features that diverge sharply from the idealized forms of earlier dynasties. Scholars have debated whether this represents a physical condition, a stylistic innovation, or a deliberate attempt to portray something beyond human form. What is clear is that it reflects a radical shift not only in belief, but in representation itself. One of the most contested pieces of evidence lies outside Amarna. In Tomb Cave Amsefkas 55 within the Valley of the Kings, a damaged mummy was discovered whose identity remains debated. Genetic studies have linked this individual to Tutankhamun, suggesting a close familial connection, possibly even Akhenaten himself. However, the age estimates and condition of the remains have produced conflicting interpretations. If this mummy does belong to Akhenaten, it would mean his body was removed from Amarna and reburied elsewhere, an act that implies both rejection and containment. Such relocation was rare and politically charged, suggesting that his successors did not simply want to forget him, but needed to control the legacy he left behind. Theories surrounding Akhenaten's tomb and its fate are deeply divided. One widely accepted explanation is that after his death, the traditional priesthood and subsequent rulers initiated a systematic campaign of erasure, a form of damnatio memoriae intended to restore the old order by eliminating all traces of his reforms. This would explain the destruction within the tomb and the abandonment of Amarna itself. Another interpretation argues that his religious system was inherently unstable, lacking the institutional support required to survive beyond a single reign, causing it to collapse almost immediately once he was gone. Yet there is a more unsettling possibility that continues to attract attention. Some researchers suggest that Akhenaten's concept of a singular universal deity was not simply an experiment, but an intellectual leap far ahead of its time, one that the society around him could neither integrate nor sustain. In this view, the erasure was not just political retaliation, but a rejection of an idea that threatened to dismantle the foundations of Egyptian civilization. The tomb of Akhenaten remains less a burial site and more a rupture in historical continuity. It is the physical record of a moment when one individual attempted to rewrite the rules governing life, death, and divinity, and nearly succeeded in doing so. But what survives today is not his system, only the fragments left behind after it was dismantled. And that leads to a final, unavoidable question. If an entire civilization moved to erase him so completely, then it was not because he was insignificant, It was because what he represented could not be allowed to remain. What if the first map humanity ever created was never meant to guide travellers, but to define reality itself? Not a tool for navigation, not a record of distances, but a statement about where the world begins, where it ends, and what lies beyond it. Because more than 2,500 years ago, in the heart of Mesopotamia, a civilization pressed symbols into wet clay and left behind something that still refuses to fit into modern logic: the clay maps of Sumer and their successors. The story begins in a landscape defined by water and control. Between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, cities rose not randomly, but through calculated engineering: canals, levees, irrigation systems stretching across kilometres of flat, flood-prone terrain. This was not just survival, it was system design. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian city-states had already developed writing, cuneiform, mathematics based on a base 60 system, and administrative records of striking precision. In such an environment, the need to understand space, fields, water routes, boundaries, was not optional, it was foundational. And yet, when we examine the maps they left behind, something doesn't align. The most famous example, known today as the Babylonian world map, Imago Mundi, dates to roughly the 6th century BCE and was later housed in the British Museum. It was discovered in the 19th century during excavations led by Hormuzd Rassam in the ruins of Sippar. At first glance, it appears primitive, a circular diagram etched into clay, intersected by lines, surrounded by wedges of text. But this simplicity is deceptive. At its centre lies Babylon, not just marked but emphasised. From it, a line extends, believed to represent the Euphrates. Around the entire known world is a perfect circle, labelled as a bitter river, interpreted as a cosmic ocean. Beyond that boundary are triangular regions, cryptically described in cuneiform texts as distant lands, places of darkness, unreachable zones, or territories associated with myth. These are not mapped like cities. They are conceptual. This is where the first rupture in logic appears. Because if this were a map in the modern sense, it fails. Distances are distorted, directions are inconsistent, geography is incomplete. But if it is not a map, then what is it? Archaeological comparisons deepen the mystery. Other clay tablets from earlier Sumerian periods depict agricultural plots with measurable boundaries, canal systems with functional layouts, or uneven city plans with relative accuracy. These were practical documents, tools for administration and engineering. In contrast, the Imago Mundi abandons precision where it matters most and replaces it with structure where none is needed. It is as if two entirely different systems of spatial thinking coexisted. One empirical, one symbolic. Excavations across Mesopotamia throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, by figures such as Austin Henry Layard, and later teams working in sites like and Nippur, revealed hundreds of tablets. Among them were fragments that, when analysed, suggested a continuity of mapping practices, yet none replicated the exact structure of the Babylonian world map. It remains unique, yet a modern analysis using high-resolution imaging and epigraphic reconstruction has confirmed that the inscriptions describe not only locations, but narratives, references to journeys, kings, and mythological events. One triangular region, for example, is associated with a land where the sun is not seen. Another describes distances that cannot be reconciled with known geography. These are not errors, they are deliberate inclusions. So what was the purpose? One leading hypothesis argues that this was a cosmological diagram, a visual synthesis of how the Babylonians understood existence. In this view, Babylon is placed at the centre, not because of geographic accuracy, but because of ideological centrality. The surrounding ocean defines the limits of the known world, while the outer regions represent the unknown, the divine, or the unreachable. It is a map of meaning, not measurement. But this explanation raises its own problem. If the same civilization was capable of highly accurate administrative mapping, tracking land, water, and infrastructure, why would they construct a world map that ignores those capabilities? Why separate practical knowledge from conceptual representation so completely? Another theory suggests that the map encodes lost geographical knowledge, regions that may have existed in different climatic conditions, or coastlines altered by flooding and sedimentation over millennia. Mesopotamia itself has undergone dramatic environmental changes. Rivers have shifted, cities have been buried, entire landscapes have been reshaped. Could the unknown regions be distorted memories of real places? More speculative interpretations go further, proposing that the map reflects inherited knowledge, traditions passed down from earlier cultures whose geographic scope exceeded that of later Mesopotamian society. While there is no direct evidence for this, the precision of certain elements, such as the central river alignment, contrast sharply with the abstraction of others, suggesting multiple layers of information embedded within a single artifact. Material analysis adds another layer of intrigue. The tablet itself, made of carefully prepared clay, was inscribed with tools capable of producing fine, consistent wedge marks. Once dried or fired, it became extraordinarily durable. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay preserves information across millennia with minimal degradation. In effect, this was a data storage medium engineered for permanence. The fact that such a medium was used for a map that is not strictly functional suggests that what it contained was considered important, perhaps even authoritative. Comparisons with later Greek cartography, such as the works of Anaximander or Hecataeus of Miletus, show a shift toward empirical representation, coastlines, relative distances, attempts at scale. In contrast, the Mesopotamian approach appears fundamentally different. It does not evolve into modern mapping. It stands apart from it, which leads to the central question that remains unresolved. Were these early maps the beginning of cartography, or evidence of a parallel system of understanding space that we no longer use? Because if we judge them by modern standards, they appear flawed. But if we assume they were never intended to meet those standards, then we're left with something far more unsettling. A civilization that mapped not the world as it is, but the world as it believed it to be structured, physically, mythologically, and cosmically, at the same time. And that possibility changes everything, because it means the first map ever created may not have been an attempt to explore the unknown, but an attempt to define its boundaries. There is a structure in northern Sudan that should not exist, at least not in the way we understand ancient engineering. It is not carved from granite, not reinforced with stone, not protected by any outer casing, and yet it rises nearly 60 feet above the desert, built almost entirely from sun-dried mud bricks. By every known rule of material decay, wind erosion, and structural fatigue, it should have collapsed centuries after it was built. Instead, it has endured for nearly 4,000 years. The Kerma Deffufa does not simply challenge history, it breaks the logic we use to interpret it, forcing us to confront a deeper question. What if the ancient world was far more technically capable than we are willing to admit? Kerma lies in what is now northern Sudan, near the third cataract of the Nile, a region that once formed the heart of a powerful but often overlooked civilization known as the Kingdom of Kerma. Between roughly 2500 and 1500 BCE, this city was not a peripheral outpost, but a major political and economic centre controlling trade routes that linked sub-Saharan Africa with Egypt and beyond. Archaeological surveys have revealed that the city extended over more than 30 hectares, organised into distinct zones including residential districts, storage facilities, administrative areas, industrial sectors, and a central religious complex dominated by the Deffufa. Unlike the stone-dominated monuments of Egypt to the north, Kerma's architecture relied heavily on mud brick, a material considered practical but inherently fragile. Yet here, in the centre of this ancient city, stands a structure that dwarfs its surroundings, a massive, irregular, multi-level construction whose purpose remains only partially understood. The site entered modern archaeological awareness in the early 20th century through the work of George Andrew Reisner, one of the most influential Egyptologists of his time. Between 1913 and 1916, Reisner conducted extensive excavations at Kerma, documenting its vast cemetery fields, monumental structures, and urban layout. However, his interpretation would shape the narrative of Kerma for decades in a way that obscured its true significance. Influenced by the prevailing belief that advanced civilization in the Nile Valley could only originate from Egypt, Reisner concluded that Kerma was not an independent kingdom, but rather an Egyptian colonial outpost, and that the Deffufa itself was likely the fortified residence of an Egyptian governor. It was a conclusion built not only on evidence but on assumption. Only later, through decades of continued excavation led by researchers such as Charles Bonnet, did a different picture emerge. Kerma was not a satellite of Egypt. It was a fully developed indigenous Nubian state, capable of constructing monumental architecture, organising large populations, and expressing power through its own unique cultural and technological systems. The most striking and unresolved mystery of the Kerma Deffufa lies in its construction and survival. The structure measures approximately 50 metres in length and over 25 metres in width, with walls several metres thick, rising in layered terraces that suggest multiple phases of expansion. Internally, it consists of a complex arrangement of narrow corridors, chambers, and elevated platforms, connected by stairways and passages that do not follow the symmetrical, axial logic seen in Egyptian temples. There is no single clear entrance axis, no obvious ceremonial procession route, and no standardized layout that fits neatly into known architectural categories. Instead, the Deffufa feels almost organic, as though it evolved over generations, each addition modifying the original plan without fully replacing it. This alone complicates attempts to define its function. But it is the material that presents the greatest enigma. Mud brick structures, even in arid climates, typically suffer from erosion, cracking, and eventual collapse unless continuously maintained. The Deffufa, however, has retained a remarkable degree of structural integrity despite centuries of exposure. This suggests a level of material knowledge and construction technique that goes beyond simple brick stacking. The composition of the bricks, the thickness of the walls, the layering strategy, and possibly even surface treatments may have contributed to a form of durability that we still do not fully replicate in comparable conditions. Archaeological excavations throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have provided a growing body of evidence that deepens rather than resolves the mystery. Excavations of the surrounding city have revealed an advanced urban system, including storage complexes capable of supporting large populations, industrial zones for metalworking and pottery production, and administrative buildings that indicate centralized control. The ceramics of Kerma, particularly the distinctive black-topped redware, are considered among the finest in ancient Africa, demonstrating precise control over firing conditions and material composition. Metal artifacts, including bronze objects, indicate a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, while imported materials such as faience and exotic goods point to long-distance trade networks. The nearby royal cemetery provides even more dramatic evidence. Massive burial mounds, some reaching 90 metres in diameter, contain not only the remains of elite individuals, but also thousands of animal skulls and in some cases, hundreds of human sacrificial burials arranged around a central tomb. One Middle Kerma burial, for example, contained over 4,000 cattle skulls, arranged in a deliberate pattern. Such practices indicate not only ritual complexity, but also the ability to mobilize and control significant resources and labor forces. When compared to Egypt, the differences are as revealing as the similarities. Egyptian monumental architecture relied on cut stone, precise geometry, and highly standardized forms that evolved over time but maintained clear continuity. Kerma, by contrast, developed a monumental tradition, using less durable materials, yet achieved comparable scale and visual dominance. The Deffufa does not replicate Egyptian temples. It represents a parallel architectural language, one that may have emphasized elevation, mass, and internal complexity over symmetry and external ornamentation. This raises a critical question. Was the Deffufa purely a religious structure, or did it serve a broader role as a political and ceremonial platform? Its central position within the city, combined with its imposing height, suggests it may have functioned as a focal point for public rituals, at a place where authority was displayed and reinforced, yet the absence of clear iconographic evidence leaves room for interpretation. Scholarly debate continues to revolve around several competing hypotheses. One view maintains that the Deffufa was primarily a temple, part of a larger sacred complex that structured the spiritual life of the city. Another suggests it may have served as a raised ceremonial platform, possibly supporting temporary structures or gatherings that left little trace in the archaeological record. A more radical perspective considers the possibility that it functioned as a hybrid structure, yet combining religious, administrative and symbolic roles in a way that does not correspond to later, more clearly defined architectural categories. Even the earlier interpretation proposed by Reisner, though largely rejected, highlights the ambiguity inherent in the structure's design. If experienced archaeologists could misidentify its function based on its form, then its architecture must encode meanings that are not immediately legible through conventional frameworks. In the end, the Kerma Deffufa forces a confrontation not only with an ancient structure, but with the limitations of modern interpretation. It stands as evidence that complexity, innovation, and large-scale organisation were not confined to the civilizations we traditionally place at the centre of history. The true psychological impact of the Deffufa lies in this realisation. It is not merely that a mud brick structure has survived against the odds, but that an entire civilization capable of creating it was once dismissed as incapable of doing so. The longer one studies Kerma, the more it becomes clear that the greatest mystery is not how the Deffufa was built, but why it took so long for the world to recognise what it represents.